Okay, let's jump right into this. I want you to close your eyes for just a second and imagine the sheer panic of a world where every single grain of rice suddenly vanishes. And I don't just mean a temporary shortage at your local supermarket or your favorite takeout spot. I mean literally gone entirely. Every single rice paddy, every massive storage warehouse, every bowl sitting on a dinner table just completely wiped out of existence.
So what would actually happen? Well, within hours, hundreds of millions of pantries around the globe would be completely empty. Within days, global food prices would just spiral completely out of control, and governments would be scrambling in total panic. Entire economies would feel this immediate, absolutely devastating shock. You see, it wouldn't just be a missing side dish, it would be a catastrophic global emergency.
And the reason for that panic really comes down to this staggering number. Over 3 billion people. 3 billion! That's more than half of all humanity, relying on rice every single day just to survive. Throughout history, empires actually collected their taxes in it, kings measured their absolute wealth in it, and brutal wars were fought over fertile valleys just to control it. It isn't just a crop, it's the foundation of life itself for a huge chunk of the planet. But the really astonishing thing, none of this was inevitable.
A wild grass becomes life. The accidental harvest.
Let's travel way back, about 12,000 years ago, to the lush, totally unpredictable wetlands of southern China. The last ice age is finally ending. Most humans are nomadic hunter-gatherers, right? They're moving constantly, pretty much living at the mercy of the seasons. But hiding in these flooded marshes is this almost invisible wild grass that honestly, no one really considered valuable. Just look at the stark contrast between these two plants. On one hand, you have ancient wild rice. We're talking tiny seeds on these fragile little stalks that shattered and dropped right into the muddy water before you could even gather them. It hardly seemed worth the effort to forage. But then compare that to domesticated rice. It has larger seeds, it's patient, it's dependable, and it actually waits on the stalk to be harvested. Now, getting from that fragile weed to this reliable crop wasn't some sudden eureka moment. It was the invisible hands of thousands of unnamed women, children, and early farmers. Generation after generation, their tiny, everyday decisions and observations slowly nudged this fragile wild grass into an absolute agricultural powerhouse.
Engineering the first cities, the architecture of civilization.
This newly domesticated plant didn't just change our diets, it literally forced humanity to invent complex societies. Because growing rice at scale requires this immense, perfectly synchronized sequence of events. Think about it. You have to dig miles of channels completely by hand. You have to shape these precise mud embankments, and then intentionally flood the fields just right to kill off competing weeds, before you can finally reap those massive yields. An entire community had to work in absolute perfect rhythm, because, well, a single broken mud wall could destroy months of hard work literally overnight. And this monumental, shared effort, it taught early humans how to plan for the distant future, how to coordinate massive labor forces, and ultimately how to organize the very first early governments.
A person was no longer simply a farmer. They were a rice farmer. I want you to really think about that for a second. This permanence profoundly changed human psychology. People were suddenly anchored to the land. The land itself acquired memory and generational value. So they built these raised granaries, and guess what happens when you can safely store massive amounts of dry grain? You create wealth. Wealth that empires could easily store, measure, and, you guessed it, tax. Rulers quickly discovered that a kingdom with full granaries could survive devastating droughts and, more importantly, fund professional armies. Rice basically laid the entire blueprint for the modern state.
The grain connects the world. The first globalizer. Now, as populations started booming, rice just couldn't stay contained in those original wetlands. It kicked off what is arguably the greatest migration in human history, hitching a ride in the pockets of migrating families, wandering merchants, and some pretty daring seafarers. 4,000 years ago, Austronesian seafarers were sailing across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, carrying these seeds to completely new islands without any maps or compasses. Incredible, right? Fast forward to the first millennium, and Silk Road merchants are trading rice seeds right alongside precious silk, jade, and spices. But then comes a massive turning point in the 11th century. A fast-ripening variety called champa rice makes its way to China, and it literally doubles their harvests because farmers could suddenly plant twice a year. This single change fueled an absolute explosion in medieval innovation. And by the time we hit the 15th century, European colonial expansion had turned rice into a deeply strategic global resource. So agriculture was out there creating these complex international networks centuries before modern borders even existed.
But we absolutely have to acknowledge a darker, incredibly important chapter of this global expansion. During the tragic history of the transatlantic slave trade, European colonizers deliberately targeted specific regions of West Africa. Why? Because the farmers there had already mastered rice cultivation over countless generations. The enslaved West African men and women brought with them this indispensable agricultural genius. We're talking specialized, highly technical knowledge of complex irrigation, flooding techniques, and seasonal timing. It was entirely their expertise, driven by forced labor, that birthed the incredibly lucrative American rice economy. It is a stark, sobering reminder that the history of this crop is completely inseparable from the immense human cost of those who were forced to cultivate it.
Science feeds a crowded planet, the race for survival. Okay, let's fast forward to the 20th century. For thousands of years, if we needed more food, farmers would just, well, clear more land. But that ancient frontier of new, untouched land began to vanish at the exact same time human population expansion just exploded. Look at the sheer scale of this boom. In the year 1900, the entire world had roughly 1.6 billion people. By the year 2000, that number had rocketed past 6 billion. This massive spike triggered a terrifying threat of global famine. It pushed traditional rice farming to its absolute breaking point. No matter how hard these farmers worked, traditional methods simply could not keep up with the overwhelming number of mouths that desperately needed feeding.
And that is where the Green Revolution enters the picture. Scientists over at the International Rice Research Institute realized they had a huge problem. When traditional, tall rice plants were given modern fertilizers, they grew way too top-heavy and literally collapsed under their own weight before they could even be harvested. So what did they do? They bred a completely new type of plant. They created these shorter, much sturdier varieties that invested all their energy into producing the actual grain, rather than growing a tall stock. This scientific breakthrough was nothing short of a miracle. It drastically increased global food production and quite literally saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation.
But, as we know, pretty much every scientific breakthrough comes with a cost. There were definitely unintended consequences here. This new high-yield rice, well, it required intense, constant irrigation and a really heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers. And worse, as these new powerhouse strains spread everywhere like wildfire, thousands of ancient traditional seed varieties just began to vanish from fields altogether. We suddenly found ourselves facing a massive threat to our genetic diversity. It got so serious that humanity was forced to create global seed banks just to protect the priceless ancient plant genes that might actually hold the key to surviving future diseases or extreme weather.
The future in a bowl, the final harvest.
So, where exactly does that leave us today, right? In a world that's inching closer and closer to 10 billion people? The whole fight for survival has fundamentally shifted. Think about the ancient threats: seasonal floods, random pest outbreaks, local droughts. These are things farmers have battled and managed for millennia. But today, our modern threats are completely unprecedented. We're dealing with rapid, unpredictable climate change. We have rising sea levels literally pushing toxic saltwater into coastal rice paddies. And, surprisingly enough, methane emissions. Yeah, it turns out flooded rice fields naturally produce methane, which is a highly powerful greenhouse gas. So today, researchers are walking this razor-thin tightrope. They are desperately trying to figure out how to reduce emissions while simultaneously growing more food than ever before in human history. It is, without a doubt, one of humanity's greatest modern agricultural puzzles.
Which brings me right back to you, and to this final, really important question. What history is hiding on your dinner plate? The next time you sit down to eat a bowl of rice, I really want you to remember that you aren't just looking at a simple, everyday side dish. You're looking at nearly 10,000 years of human ingenuity.
You are looking at the epic history of civilization itself, the sheer brilliance of modern science, and the tireless, backbreaking labor of millions of unnamed farmers. And all of that epic history is resting right there in the palm of your hand.
Humans changed rice. Rice changed humans. Together, they changed the world. Just think about that the next time you take a bite. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer of such a fascinating journey. If this changed the way you see this incredible grain, please go ahead and share this explainer with someone else who will never look at a simple bowl of rice the same way again. Because history isn't just hidden away in dusty museums. Sometimes it's waiting right there on your dinner plate. Stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.